All of us in our lives live according to some inner impulse that we are barely conscious of. We just take for granted who we are. It starts from our babyhood, and as little infants we begin to toddle around and figure out what this world is about and figure out what kind of people we're going to be, and we're definitely not a clean slate because we take incarnation where we take it and the way we take it because of where we left off in the last incarnation. But then all that force gets started and we find our way, most of the time without any external awareness of what we're really doing. Our parents are just guiding us and we're responding to that guidance. I'm sure all of you from time to time have done as I have done and looked at pictures of yourself as a child and remembered certain moments and certain things that we did. Whenever I get my hair cut in this little curly haircut and the hairdresser is going like this, I always have this picture of my mother saying to me, "Come over here, honey, and let me squinch your hair." That's what she would say. She had very straight hair and she loved my curly hair and she would squinch my hair. Just like somewhere deeply embedded in me is the fact that my hair will go like this, especially if you squinch it. And I have the picture of my loving mother squinching my hair, and then I see myself at the age of 4. I have a little picture of myself at 4 with this basically the same haircut and the same little smile, just sitting there. As Swamiji said about himself, same old fella, 86 years old now, 4 years old then, same old fella. There's a picture of Swami Kriyananda when he was about 4 or 5, I think, maybe a little younger. And it's in a photographer's studio, and he's coming off of the little seat wherever he's supposed to be having his picture taken. He's moving forward, and they captured the picture right then. Swamiji explained that his parents, he had a particular expression of determination and willpower that they really enjoyed, and they wanted the photographer to catch it. So they held on the other side of the camera some object that he could have, and then he moved toward it with that energy, and they took his picture right then. All of us have this extraordinary individuality. I mean, you're looking forward this way. Some of you from the back are seeing other people's heads. I'm seeing all of your faces. And I don't have any trouble telling you apart. I can't always remember all of your names. Thank you for wearing your buttons. But every single face is a different face. And how did that happen? And it's very fun sometimes, perhaps you have done it, I certainly have, stood in the mirror and examined the road not taken. The crabby face, the old face, the angry face, the grumpy face, just how these very same features, not even somebody else's, can take on a wholly different look just by putting an attitude behind your mind, in your mind, behind your face, and just see which way it's going to go. Swamiji tells an extraordinary story about being in a train station in Rome, having gone to the station to meet a particular friend. And he said that particular friend was going through a period of very serious spiritual testing and was not actually always choosing the highest path. And he waited for his friend and he didn't see them anywhere. It was a woman he was meeting. He didn't see her anywhere. And he couldn't imagine how he'd missed her, so he went to the waiting room and he saw one woman standing there, and he walked up and then very tentatively he said her name, and it was her. He said her appearance was so shifted by the shift in her consciousness that he didn't even recognize her. Now, Swamiji is also talking about how he recognizes people, which is not so much from their faces as from their energy. I've told you the story before of at a certain point in our lives at Ananda, this couple was, they'd been married for a few years and they'd always had a very difficult marriage, and then they separated. And I recited that we were having just a dinner table conversation, and I remarked that an incident that I'd had with the wife, and we had gone out to buy a birthday present for her husband, and I held up a shirt and I said, "This is a beautiful shirt. It would go nicely with the color of his eyes." She said to me, "Would it? What color are his eyes?" Oh my God, I thought. So, when they were getting divorced, that was no surprise to me. So I just said this at the table, and everyone said, oh yeah, yeah. Swamiji had this incomprehending look on his face. And then he said, I have no idea what color people's eyes are. He said, I don't look at their eyes. He said, I look into their eyes. I look through their eyes. I look at the consciousness that's coming through it. And then he turned to Seva, who had been his right-hand worker for decades at that point. And Seva has these huge brown eyes. It's her defining feature. And he turned to her and he said, oh, your eyes are brown. It's like there are many different ways to live in this world. And we make our decision and we just think our way of doing things is just the right way to do things. We're raised up by our family, we're raised up by our culture. When we came back from one of our pilgrimage trips to India one year, I think there were 3, maybe there were 5, tiny Indian infants who were being adopted into American families. Actually, there were 6 babies, there were 3 women, and 6 babies. Each woman was taking care of 2 infants. I said, how can you take care of 2 infants? She said, watch, the whole plane will help. And she was actually correct, We were tripping over ourselves to help take care of those babies, bringing them home. And they all had very, very American names, James Edward Livingston, this little tiny Indian child, just having been, picked out of New Delhi, was now James Edward Livingston on his way to Minnesota, I think is where they were going, or Milwaukee, somewhere. And it was so extraordinary just to look at them and think that some part of their being had drawn them to be conceived and born in that particular ethnicity, that particular culture, but now they were being plucked out of it and dropped in the middle of something completely other. But you see, none of this is random. And this is the most extraordinary part of it, because we all can feel it within ourselves, can't we? How very, very deliberately we go through the experiences that we go through. That's one of the things that you have to remember when you work with small children, is they're short and they're powerless. But that doesn't mean they aren't fully formed. And even if the context in which they express it seems to us, not very sophisticated, because their lack of experience makes it difficult for them to see things in a big way, but their inner experience is completely different. A woman who writes, Taylor Caldwell is her name, she writes novels about past lives, and she says a lot of them are her own memories. Swamiji says, isn't it interesting, though, how heroic and special she is in every one of her memories, but nonetheless. But she has an interesting statement. She says when little children feel that they're imagining that they're doing something wonderful, Mommy, Mommy, watch me dance, and she's picked up her scarves and she's going like this and she's leaping through the room. And she's so enamored of what she's doing. She says it's because the children are actually living through previous incarnations, often, in which, in fact, they were magnificent at what they were doing. I vividly recall being 4 years old with my next-door neighbor. Her name was Joni, but in this terrible way of children, we called her Wivels. Wivels was her name. Wivels, my best friend. And we did sculpture. And we got mud and we wet it. And I remember my piece of work. It was 3 balls, one on top of the other, like a little snowman. But I still have this inner experience of sculpting that piece of work. And after all these years, I still remember it as being just so magnificent. And I remember carrying it in and wanting my mother to bronze it somehow. She was a good mom, and she tried hard not to disappoint me, but also to explain that you can't really take 3 balls of mud and bronze them. But I was quite determined, that this great piece of art had to be preserved. And somehow or another, she must have kept it on the shelf or something, because I never remembered being disappointed. But ever after, I've still had this sensation of artistic work like that. Now, from the point of view of the infant, and I'm not sure that our great work is any greater than my little thing when I was a child, But what we're always working with is we're working with this personal destiny. This is the oddest thing about being a human being. And periodically, and recently I was asked again, why did God make creation like this? How much free will do we have? And on with all these questions that we always ask, because we're caught. And we know that we're caught. We're caught in this extraordinary sense of personal freedom and identity, and simultaneously we're smart enough to know that we're utterly helpless in the middle of this. And so we start asking questions, and we impose the word God on it, and we want him to either be responsible or not responsible, or it's up to me or it's not up to me. It's not really quite clear where we're trying to go with this, except that we're just trying to unravel this extraordinary mystery of our own being. Last night, Swami Kriyananda, the founder of Ananda, is in Seattle, Washington, in our community there. And last night in the evening, he spoke at a public gathering, and they did a live stream over the internet. So many of us watched him last night, even in real time as he was speaking. And he started talking about his life with Paramhansa Yogananda, his guru and our guru, except that Kriyananda was young enough, old enough now, at a time that Yogananda was living, to actually have direct experience with him. Kriyananda was 22 years old. 64 years ago, he became a disciple and lived with Yogananda for the last 4 years. So he's talking to us about his contact with his guru, and a great deal of the time that he spent with Yogananda was completely private. No one else was around. He went out to the desert retreat with him, and then he was talking about how he often used to, Master would have him serve when others came to lunch. People would come to lunch, and Swamiji would put the food on the table and take the plates away and so on. And then after the guests were gone, Yogananda would sit at the table with him, just with Swamiji, and they would talk. They would talk about the teachings. They would talk about everything, Yogananda's life, Kriyananda's life, because Yogananda was putting into Swami Kriyananda both the understanding and the power to carry on what he's carried on in the 60 years since Yogananda died, which is to be the instrument of his teachings. Now, I rarely have this thought, but it crossed my mind, just this little thought, oh, wow, wouldn't it have been wonderful to be the one who got to sit at that table? And of course, envy or the wish that things could be other than they are, wanting to have experiences that weren't your karmic destiny to have, it's extremely natural thought. We're always fighting against the meannesses of the heart, and jealousy and envy are two really solid ones. If you're a big woman and you see people who are little and petite, you always think, oh, if only I could have been little and petite. If you see people who can just eat anything they want without ever gaining weight, you think, for that metabolism. If you aren't blessed with curly hair, you may think that I think my mother envied my curly hair. It's just so common. It is one of the meannesses of the heart. It's what binds us to ego. And this thought just came through my mind at that moment. But wait a minute. We are not really separate from one another. Even though we have this illusion of separateness that we've lived since infancy, which I've been talking about, in fact, we are all manifestations of the same spirit. Even more profoundly than that, we are all, in fact, only one consciousness. Now, these are words, and they're interesting words. In fact, they're amazing words. But they're really just words, because we kind of do feel separate from each other, don't we? We're all going to get in our own little cars, and we're going to drive to different places. And when you get back to your house and I get back to my house, we won't feel like we're together anymore. Or will we? We have the experience, many of us already, of the consciousness of these masters, where you can go alone into your meditation room, and with sufficient focus and devotion, you can become conscious of the fact that there is a presence there with you, isn't it so? And even quite apart from those masters whose consciousness have transcended time and space and can come and reach us, I mean, think of every mother and father and their newborn child, or the bond between children and parents even now, or between very good friends. I've had a couple of very interesting experiences. There was a period in my life where every so often I would dream someone else's life, and was very impressive in my intuition afterwards. I remember a man was in a great deal of trouble, and I anticipated his problem. I dreamt of him just weeping and weeping, and I called him and then said, "Are you okay?" He said, "Oh, yeah, just fine." And then a few days later, something really terrible happened to him. And another time I had a woman come into my dreams, and again, she was quite off from Dharma, but she was hiding it. And it just came into my dreams, and I just knew it. I know all of you have the same experiences. The phone rings, and you know who's on the other end of the phone. Just as simple as that, because even though we appear to be separate, there's a point at which all of our consciousness comes together. And so sitting there with that sort of little bit of longing for a life that wasn't my life, that wasn't really the one that was given to me, I suddenly thought, but if it happens to anyone, it also happens to me. Isn't that an interesting way to think about it? If in the end we're all going to come together, and the end meaning at the end of our long journey away from God, and we come back into the awareness of our true nature, which was never changed, we merely turned our back on it. But you see, in that consciousness, what happens to anyone happens to us. And then all of a sudden you have this picture of how generous-hearted, elevated souls can be, and how completely they enjoy everybody's happiness. And I was thinking of these poems in Whispers from Eternity that sometimes we read, "Teach me to spend for others as joyously as I spend for myself. Teach me to rejoice at other people's success as much as I rejoice for my own success. And teach me to be as eager to alleviate the suffering of my fellow man as I am to alleviate my own." And we read these and we think, these are lovely sentiments, aren't they? But these are not sentiments. These are facts. These are realities that if we continue to follow the trajectory that we are consciously on or unconsciously on, sooner or later, all those realities will merge. And all of the spiritual practices that we do, of taking care of others, of serving others, of being kind, of being supportive, of tithing our money, of giving our time, what we're doing is we're practicing reality. We're not doing these because God has a checklist, and if you're good in this way, then you'll get these rewards. When a disciple came to Ramakrishna and was so proud of how much money they gave to the temple, Ramakrishna responded, "But God was already that money. He was not impressed when you gave it back to him." We think that we're buying favor somewhere. We're not buying favor. We are acting, perhaps with willpower, to affirm a reality that is actually our reality, that is more true than the mistakes we're living now. I go back to my conversation with Swamiji about the color of the man's eyes, and we think we're being so sort of attentive by knowing the color of our husband's eyes or our children's eyes. We think we're paying attention, and then Swami tells us, but the color of their eyes is such a superficial quality about them. How many pairs of eyes have they had through all the incarnations that you've known them? Swamiji, I've noticed a quality in him. Sometimes I've traveled with him a lot through the years, and for the first 5 or 6 years that I knew him in the 70s, I was his secretary and his appointment secretary, and I would follow him around with a little pad of paper. And even then, it's nothing compared to now, but even then there were many hundreds of people in his life, and it was sort of my job to remember them. So I could whisper to him, who this person was and what their name was, or conscientiously introduce them, or whatever it might be. And I would watch this sometimes, and I saw it more as we would travel around the world, and distances in time became greater. And he would go to Europe for the first time after a few months, which sometimes we would accompany him. And people would come, and at first he would be gracious like this. Oh yes, so nice to see you. And then a few seconds or a minute would pass, and then all of a sudden he'd turn back and really greet them. He would just sort of suddenly realize who this person was, and he articulated it this way. He says, sometimes after a separation, I don't recognize someone. But then if I look into their eyes, suddenly they come into focus, is how he put it. And now what's so interesting about that is that I watched him do that for people he was meeting for the first time in this incarnation. And he would look into the eyes, and then after a moment, the person would come into focus. Because, oh, the last time I knew you, you know you were an Egyptian man, and now you're an Italian woman, or whatever it might be, but the self-same jiva, the individual, is still there, and we're looking at each other, and we know each other. So compared to that, the color of the eyes, the gender, the personality, what is reality here? And so we need to learn to affirm the highest level that we live on, someone we can live on. Somebody said to Swamiji once, he was a guest at our retreat, and he said to Swamiji, he said, "Sir, I've been here a week. I feel more love from you and from the people here," he said, "than I have felt even from my own family." He said, "How is it possible? You don't even know me." And Swamiji said, "Well, you're right. I don't know you as a personality with all the life experiences that you have like your family does. Your family knows you from infancy. They can tell endless stories about you." He said, "But when I look into your eyes, I see the same God that I see everywhere, and I already love that divine. And so what I'm loving is what I already know in you." And then everything else sort of fills in after that. And this is what I was thinking, watching Swamiji talking about being a young man sitting across the table, talking to Master in person, not just in spirit, but in person, about the spiritual life. If it happens to one, it happens to all of us. Because anything that anyone does is simply an aspect of the same consciousness that we already are. And this is the only job that we really have in life, is to come closer and closer and closer to that reality. All the rules of spiritual life, daily meditation, becoming a disciple, being devoted, serving, giving your money, being kind to one another, is so that we can gradually train ourselves, just as we've trained ourselves since babyhood. You know, we learned all these different things. We went to college, maybe we got a professional degree. We learned how to cook or serve or work or make money doing this or whatever it might be, care for babies, whatever it might be. Why are we doing all of that? I mean, do we ever stop and think why we did all of that? We just sort of do it, just kind of helter-skelter. We're being compelled by this power, and that power, truthfully, really has nothing to do with us. That power is the power of the ocean calling the river back to itself. And we're wandering around thinking, just imagine all the places that a river goes, and it thinks of all those places as an end in itself. But you see, the river doesn't even exist except as a force in motion. And so are we. We don't really exist. We're not really the color of these eyes. We are a force in motion, and that force in motion is this little piece of the infinite that got itself engaged in the pathway to wherever it was that is now being compelled back to the sea. And the more we embrace that, the more we rule our lives by that single passion, the more we bring our lives into as much conformity with that reality as is natural to us and as we are capable of expressing. You know, I was talking to Nitai about the teenagers in the high school and the challenges that they offer to them. I love the way he put this. We want to test them to their limits, but not to the point of actually traumatizing them. And he said sometimes it's a fine line. And I mentioned some adventure that some of the teenagers had told me about being in some foreign country late at night without a hotel. He said, well, that was verging on trauma, he said. That was right on the edge. But that's exactly what we have to do with ourselves. We have to recognize at what point we can push ourselves successfully beyond this, at what point we just have to wait until the plant is stronger. But never losing sight, even for a moment, of why we were born and what we were doing here. We are passing through. We are a force of energy. We are the river moving to the sea. We are a tiny bubble of laughter, trying to become the sea of mirth itself. And much as we enjoy being that bubble of laughter, imagine what it will be to be the sea of mirth itself. God